Hi, thanks for tuning in and welcome to Mount Vernon. My name is Jason Boroughs. I'm the research archaeologist here. And today we wanted to talk a little bit, we wanted to highlight a few of our archaeological projects that we've done, but we also wanted to talk a little bit about how we understand archaeology here at Mount Vernon and really what informs our research questions. What are the types of questions we ask and really how do we know what we know? So I wanted to start off by kind of just orienting you guys so you can kind of see where we are. Through the trees over here on my left, I guess that would be your right, you can see the mansion and the Potomac River. And the other side here, we have the reconstructed blacksmith shop. So we're standing right on the north lane. If you're familiar with Mount Vernon, we're in kind of the key core of the plantation area here, right in the heart of it all. And today we're going to talk about the enslaved community, particularly here on the home farm. We'll talk a little bit about the community at large, how Mount Vernon was organized, and we'll highlight one of our archaeological projects, which was the House for Families, one of the primary quartering sites for enslaved folks here on the Mansion House farm. If you could put up the image, please, Jeanette, number one image. We're trying some technical things here, folks, so hopefully this will work out okay. So you should be seeing a map. I want to take you back to 1799, which is actually the year that George Washington passed away. And that year, he actually conducted a census, recorded all the enslaved folks that resided at Mount Vernon and where they lived. George Washington expanded Mount Vernon quite a bit over the decades that he lived here. And at the time of his passing in 1799, he had amassed 8,000 acres across 5 different farms. The core farm here was called Mansion House Farm, or sometimes the Home Farm, and it's what you visit today if you come to visit our property, and we hope to welcome you back as soon as it's safe to do so. And it's about 500 acres, give or take, that are maintained by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, that are preserved with its 18th century character, the buildings, the landscapes, etc. Here at Mansion House Farm, this is where primarily the skilled folks worked. The other 4 farms, which are River Farm, Union Farm, Dogue Run, and Muddy Hole Farm, today basically parts of modern Fairfax County in this corner of Virginia, that is where the agricultural tasks primarily took place. Now what you're seeing, and it's a little jumbled, at the bottom of the map, the center farm is Mansion House Farm. Right there on the Potomac, should be just north of the M and the Potomac River on the map. And this map is actually redrawn based upon a survey that George Washington drew himself. Remember, his first job was as a surveyor. So he surveyed his own property. This map was later reproduced, and we like to use it to kind of show that organization. So you should see the other 4 farms kind of surrounding the center here, the nerve center, and the patch in the middle that is not agricultural space was actually forested. This is all very important space because the figures that you're looking at in 3 different colors represent enslaved men, women, and children that lived across these 5 farms, these 8,000 acres. They're actually broken down, and this is a pretty unique plantation for the Chesapeake region in a sense, in that we have 3 different lines of ownership that are represented on this map. First, and I don't remember which color is which, actually I'm going to take a look myself. The blue individuals are people that were owned outright by George Washington. He inherited 23 individuals from family members, and the rest he purchased throughout his life into the 1760s and 70s, and then their children also became his enslaved people as well. The red figures are people that came to Mount Vernon with Martha Washington when she married George Washington. Now, this is a little tricky because she didn't own these people outright. Her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, was one of the wealthiest people in the British North American colonies. He passed away. They lived in Williamsburg, Virginia. When he passed away, he didn't leave a will. So by Virginia law and English law at the time, she was, as the widow, entitled to part of the estate, and that included the enslaved people. So she inherited a life interest in all of those individuals. She came to Mount Vernon in 1759 with 84 individuals as she left Williamsburg. Many of those people lived across other plantations throughout Tidewater, Virginia, and came here. We now think many of them came here as family groups already or extended family groups. It's a little complicated because Martha Washington didn't own these people outright. She owned a life interest in their labors, meaning she was barred from selling them, she was barred from manumitting or freeing them. Basically, they did whatever she wanted them to do during her lifetime, and they were bound by custom and law to be passed to her heirs upon her death. The green folks that you see on this map were actually people that were rented from neighboring farms by George Washington. And most of those individuals either work at, and I should have mentioned this before, we have the agricultural complex, so the fields and the commodity crops. We have a distillery, one of the prime money makers for George Washington towards the end of his life. And there was also commercial fishery, where the folks that were enslaved on these farms were taking up to 1 million shad out of the Potomac River each year. The majority of those fish were actually salted and sent to the Caribbean as provisions for enslaved people there, although they also made part of the provisioning system here at Mount Vernon as well. So if we talk about the community itself, what we're really talking about are 317 enslaved people that lived across these 5 farms in 1799, plus the Washington family, of course, and a group of white plantation administrators and skilled craftspeople that often oversaw some of these other enslaved folks. Now here at Mansion House Farm in 1799, we had a little over 90 enslaved individuals. The rest of the folks were spread out across those 4 farms, primarily engaged in those other agricultural and commercial activities. Now, if we talk about the family structures, I mentioned that some of the folks that came here with Martha Washington were probably already organized into families. At the time, many of these individuals were probably born in Africa. They were born across the western and central coast of Africa and brought across the Atlantic to the Chesapeake ports of entry from Williamsburg to the Potomac here. Others were born in America and they become the first generations of African Americans. Some of those folks were already organized into families and extended families when they arrived in Mount Vernon. Others organized themselves into families and built a community here that's really represented by the individuals on this map. I need to talk a little bit more about that, and then we get into the archaeology and how this makes sense and how we think about the archaeology. So first of all, in 1799, 2/3 of the enslaved adults here at Mount Vernon were married. George Washington actually promoted marriage. By Virginia law and by British law, enslaved people in the colonies were not considered citizens. They were disenfranchised of all legal rights of marriage. But marriage was still a very big social custom, and it was understood, and enslaved marriages were typically recognized. And George Washington was one of those people that actually thought that promoting enslaved marriages would make life more bearable for the individuals that have to live their lives under enslavement, and would help them find meaning in their lives and contribute to greater productivity across an agricultural estate such as this. We know that he changed his ideas about enslavement as he became older in his life, and certainly after the Revolutionary War, and we think he probably came to recognize the humanity of these folks in a way that maybe he didn't before. But in either instance, these are the people that really built Mount Vernon. You're looking at George Washington's vision and his legacy here, but at the same time, the folks that are actually putting that legacy, putting that vision into action are this enslaved force. Now, of those individuals that are married, only about 1/3 of them were able to live in the same dwelling, in the same house as a family. People lived depending upon where their work task was, their assigned work task. So another 1/3 of those enslaved individuals had spouses that resided on one of the other 5 farms. Now, Mount Vernon is pretty centralized, so that means that if you're working 6 days a week, people would visit their families either at night or on Sundays, the free day off, or occasional holidays such as Easter or Christmas. And another 1/3 of those individuals were married to people off plantation, off of Mount Vernon. So we have to think about, when we talk about the domestic space here, and we'll look at the House for Families quartering site as we walk over here in just a second, we have to think who really lived there. There are individuals that are skilled laborers, such as masons, carpenters, the spinners, the folks that are taking care of the livestock, the blacksmiths crew here. primarily the folks that are not engaged in agricultural activities. But they often have spouses that live on those other farms and children. Children resided wherever the mother resided. I'll give you an example of a carpenter, an enslaved carpenter that lived here named Sam Anderson. His wife lived at River Farm, which is right up the Potomac River here, and he had 6 children with her. He often visited. We know that he actually had a boat that he built. He was a carpenter, and he probably used that boat to get back and forth to see his family as often as possible. And we also know that George Washington frequently borrowed his boat. He actually asked permission. One last thing about the community, and we'll look at the archaeology here. When George Washington passed away in 1799, he had written a will that provided for the manumission of Billy Lee, his enslaved valet that followed him through the Revolution and into the presidency outright upon his death. The other individuals, a little less than half of the population that resided at Mount Vernon, were to be freed upon Martha Washington's death. She died in 1802. She actually put that manumission into action and freed George Washington's enslaved people in 1801. Now, remember, Martha didn't actually own the individuals that she had life rights to. So, although George Washington's enslaved people were freed in 1801, their family members that were part of the Custis line of ownership were actually disseminated to the different heirs of Martha Washington, including several grandchildren, many of which stayed in kind of the DC, Northern Virginia, Lower Maryland area, but others that went as far away as what is today West Virginia. So to continue our Sam Anderson example, he was owned by Washington. He actually was freed. His family, his wife, and children were all part of that Custis cohort. They actually remained in the area, and he purchased a plot of land to live near them so that he could still be near his family. And he actually purchased several of his children and grandchildren out of enslavement in the decades as we went into the 19th century. So we have a very complicated picture of the enslaved community here. And really, it's most useful to think about Mount Vernon as a large neighborhood. It's a very large plantation neighborhood that's held together with family ties. Family ties through the Washingtons and through the enslaved folks that lived on these properties as well. And we have to keep all of that in mind as we excavate the places they lived and worked and their final places of rest, such as the cemetery here at Mount Vernon as well. So with that, and that was a little bit longer primer than I expected to give on that, but we'll walk over to where the House for Families quartering site was. We'll talk about the archaeology, and I'll show you guys some of the artifacts that were recovered from that site. Okay, so we're standing in the middle of the north lane. We haven't actually walked that far to give you guys an idea of how close we are to the mansion. We're a couple of hundred feet maybe from the mansion house where the Washingtons resided. What you should see now is basically a large patio, paved area. The House for Families was a large 2.5-story framed building that we know was standing in the 1760s. We don't actually know when it was constructed, but it was ordered dismantled in 1792 or 93. We actually have a painting, which is our second image, if you wouldn't mind putting that up there. In the painting, you can see it was painted in 1792 or 93. You can see the mansion, obviously, facing the Potomac there. You should be able to see the blacksmith shop, which is the building at the corner, and the very large 2.5-story frame building, hopefully has an arrow pointing to it, so you can see it says House for Families. That stood basically where we are right here. In the 1780s, by an earlier census of enslaved folks, we know that about 67 people resided here on the home or the mansion farm. And the majority of those individuals probably lived in that large structure. It was probably compartmentalized into different rooms, and you can see the very large chimneys. So we probably had multiple heating sources. But this whole area here, and we'll kind of walk through it, is the core, or the primary domestic space that enslaved folks resided here on the home farm for decades. And I just wanted to kind of walk from the area where the mansion was to this area so you can actually see how close we are in proximity to where the Washingtons lived as well. It's not that far away, right? So there's really not too much to see right in this space. but the painting shows a lot. You see the very large structure. If you look just to the right of the painting, you see some lower kind of flanking brick structures, and then another 2.5-story brick structure right in the center of that. That's the greenhouse. The greenhouse was standing at the same time as the house for families, but those little flanking additions, those low 1-story brick structures, were actually built just before the house for families was torn down. In 1799, a little over 90 individuals lived here on the Mansion House farm, and that building was simply not large enough to house the enslaved population as it grew. So it was dismantled. Those two flanking, low-lying wings of the greenhouse became one of the core spaces, primarily for either unmarried individuals or people whose spouses lived on one of those other 4 farms or off plantation. Now, just behind the camera, there's not really much to see today other than a hedge of magnolias that are beautiful in bloom this time of year, and a 20th century office building. We do know that in the 1790s, as the house for families was torn down and the brick buildings that we'll walk into in a second were erected, there were also a series of small dwellings, probably cabins or log cabins, small frame structures that house individual or extended family units, where you would have folks living under the same roof right here across from the brick barracks that we'll take a look at in a second. So on each side of the road where I'm standing, you would have had domestic spaces for the enslaved folks that lived here at Mansion Farm. 1792 is an important year for the enslaved community here. George Washington actually set about reconfiguring the quarters across all 5 farms. He actually erected new quarters on some of those agricultural properties, and here it's when he raised the big building and built these, and he ordered actually the old necessary, which is one of our highlighted excavations from last year, which is basically an outbuilding, the bathroom. He ordered that dismantled from the east lawn, which was the backyard facing the Potomac of the mansion, to the quarter here. And if that was unable to be moved, he ordered a new one to be erected. So he was actually reorganizing the quarters. He actually built new wells here and at several of the other quarters as well. And he was kind of reconfiguring the whole estate. If we take a look at our third image, it actually shows some of the archaeology shots. Okay. It actually shows some of the archaeology that we were able to do in the 80s and in the early 90s. Now, this really doesn't look like much, right? I mean, we're looking at a kind of a small square hole in the ground. You should be able to see the brick foundation that formed the corners of that. It's basically a cellar, or at least it's part of a surviving cellar. One side of it was actually cut by a boiler unit that was placed in the ground to heat the mansion and all of these outbuildings in the late 19th and early 20th century as a means of fire prevention. We didn't want to use the fireplaces in the outbuildings anymore for obvious reasons. So we installed at the time a state-of-the-art boiler system to actually pump hot water through pipes into those spaces. It actually cut the cellar space. We actually don't know how much it cut the cellar space. What you're looking at is what was left. Now, the reason that's very important for us is it's a partial cellar that was underneath the quartering site that housed enslaved people. So anywhere else we do archaeology on this state, we have to think whose hands might have touched these objects we're taking out of the ground. It could have been the Washingtons. It could have been the Marquis de Lafayette. It could have been a visitor at any time throughout any of the periods that the Washingtons were here, or it could have been something that passed through the hands of the enslaved folks that resided on these farms. But this space and this cellar was underneath their domestic space. These are their objects, and they can tell us more about the people that lived in that building than probably other parts of the estate that we're privileged to excavate. So that's why this is a very important small time capsule. It goes from the 1760s again to the early 1790s, and we're looking at several decades of the objects left behind by the enslaved folks that resided on this part of the estate. And we'll actually show you some of those objects in a second, and you see some of them in the image there. We have a lot of domestic refuse, things like tablewares, like the ceramics you're seeing, glass bottles, tobacco pipes. This was a tobacco plantation early on before it was diversified into making cereal grains. And a lot of personal items, things like buttons and beads. and also items of food procurement. We'll talk about and look at some of those faunal remains, basically the bones that are left behind from land animals, from fish, from seafood, and lead shot and gun flints that are used for hunting those items, which often surprise folks. We'll take a look and talk a little bit more about those as well. So we'll get out of the sun and we'll move into the later quarters, which are those brick flanking structures that we talked about that were built as the House for Families was raised, as it was taken down. I should also point out, and I'm going to try to walk backwards and not fall over. I should also point out that in the 1830s, there was a fire here, and these structures right here, these brick quarters, were actually burned, not completely to the ground, but the foundations that remained were basically 3 feet or so off the ground. So these have actually been restored based upon the surviving foundations, and part of the foundations are original and part are restored. But they're also restored based upon historic documents that talk about how these things were organized, and they're based on archaeology. We'll go inside and I'll point some of that out. And they're based on remembrances that are left behind by visitors, and obviously the painting as an example that you saw a second ago. Okay, so some of the major things to point out in here, first of all, are the sleeping spaces. They're kind of military-style bunks, and you can kind of see how you have these sleeping compartments. This was primarily a space for folks that would have either had, again, spouses that resided elsewhere, or for unmarried individuals, right? So this is kind of like a bunkhouse, right? We do have a pretty large fireplace that would have served for heating, for cooking, for all of your basic necessities. And you can kind of see some of the objects we've laid out. These are based upon archaeology, and these are based upon documents that are left behind, such as inventories, right? And purchase orders, things that we know that were here. We do actually have a paved brick floor. And I should also mention that if we went out to the quarters on the outlying farms, which we actually haven't been able to do any archaeology upon really at the moment, we're hoping to one day, those probably looked very different than this. We're probably thinking something like 1.5 story wooden structures or log cabins. You either have 1 or 2 rooms, typically dirt floors. And we do know that on the outlying quarters, folks actually raised poultry, and they also grew gardens to supplement their food rations. And so we expect that there would have been gardens here as well. We're not quite sure about the poultry because we already had the livestock here on this farm, but we do know that there were probably gardens as well. Your food rations were basically cornmeal or grits. And because this was a commercial fishery, typically you're getting about 20 salted shad or salted herring per month. That works out to about a peck of cornmeal and 5 to 8 ounces thereabouts of salted fish a day per adult. That's not a significant amount of food, right? So we know, and we'll show you the objects in the next room that came out of the House for Family cellar, that enslaved folks were prompted to hunt and gather, right, to acquire food elsewhere. We do have the resources of the Potomac, and we have a lot of fish bones, we have a lot of seafood. We obviously have the vegetables that are being grown, and we actually have remains of those as well, things such as pits and seeds and other types of artifacts that are left in the ground. And we have the items of food procurement, things like fishing hooks and sinkers, and we also have the gun flint and the lead shot that we'll talk about in the next room. So when you look in here, you see some of the plantation provisions, and you would have also seen, well, obviously we've got the rabbit over here, right? And we would have had salted fish, or occasionally salted pork, or after the harvest time in the fall, when you would have slaughtered hogs and began to make the process of Virginia hams, things that are famous in this region, enslaved folks probably would have gotten some cuts of those, of the pork as well. All right, and you can see the fish, actually, hopefully you can see the fish. Okay, so we'll actually move into the next room that actually has a case of artifacts that were taken from the House for Family cellar, and we'll actually show you those and open up for some questions. I don't know how well this will turn up, but you have a close-up of the painting here. You can actually see the House for Families. It's this pretty massive timber frame structure. This is the greenhouse, and here is the flanking newer quarter, the lower one that we just walked out of. So we're actually in this part of that wing next to the greenhouse. And in the case here, you can actually see examples of some of the types of artifacts that came out of that cellar. And as I mentioned, it's a lot of domestic things, right? This is a living space. So we do have a lot of things that you would expect to find in a domestic living space. Things like different bits of ceramics. These are all different forms of plates. And they actually go through several different periods of the 18th century here. For example, the white salt glazed stoneware, number 22, that we have the 3 fragments of. We typically find that here in an earlier period. It was one of George Washington's favorite patterns. It's honestly one of my favorite as well. It's an early form of mass-produced plate that came out of Staffordshire in Wedgwood factories in Staffordshire, England. Number 21, right above it, is its successor, which is called creamware, which was first patented in 1762, and we know arrives at Mount Vernon from a purchase order in 1769. So you're looking at the different phases here through the artifacts. They're basically like time fragments that can tell us about how things change over time here. A couple of tobacco pipes. And I wanted to point out number 3 here, which doesn't look like much with the naked eye, right? It's a piece of ceramic. It is actually an earthenware, so it's a low-fired ceramic. It's handmade. It's called colonoware. If you're from South Carolina, archaeologists call it colonoware there. But it was first discovered in the Chesapeake region, and we know that it exists basically everywhere that African-descended folks lived in the New World, from the Caribbean up through the Carolinas and into the Chesapeake Bay region where we are. This probably wasn't made at Mount Vernon, but it was definitely made on a local plantation by probably enslaved African hands. People that brought the skills of making pottery from West Africa, which was a very sophisticated pottery tradition, to the New World. That's an example of colonoware found here, and we have quite a bit of it. We've got wine bottles that were used and reused for storing anything you can think of. We actually have some fancy stemware. These are wine glasses, and the bone handle to either a knife or a fork. This is pretty fancy stuff. We actually have Chinese porcelain as well. And then over here, some of the most interesting things to me personally are the food remains, the faunal materials. And I should have pointed out as well that this is an incomplete case. We actually have a lot of these items in our current museum exhibit, which is called Lives Bound Together, which is about the enslaved community here in Mount Vernon. And I encourage you guys to check that out online. Hopefully when it's safe to open everything up, you can come see it in person. But for the moment, we do have quite a bit of online resources about that. And you can see a lot more of the objects and the artifacts that relate to enslaved lives here. But this case in particular, we've got a lot of the faunal remains, the animal remains. In Lives Bound Together, we have a lot of the floral remains. And some of those items that are very interesting to me personally, items that are gathered for food, such as persimmons. Anybody from this part of the world that grew up in rural Virginia has probably known, seen, or eaten persimmons. It was highly exploited by native peoples as well as indigenous to this area. And things like locust pods that come from honey locusts and black locusts that were also highly exploited by native populations that were used by enslaved folks to do everything from being a food source to medicinal. There were a lot of medicinal plants that were utilized by enslaved healers. And a lot of that knowledge system was formed over generations, particularly on plantations such as Mount Vernon, where you have these deep roots that go back through generations. People are passing along that knowledge from generation to generation to descendants today that tell us a little bit about what they know about their ancestors that lived here. I wanted to point out this small bit right here, number 37, is actually a gunflint and a handful or a slight handful of different sizes of lead shot. To go back to Sam Anderson, the enslaved carpenter that lived here, we know that he actually became a skilled beekeeper, and he sold honey and beeswax to George Washington, to the Washington household. He was also a skilled hunter, along with many other folks that were enslaved here. And they obviously would hunt for themselves and their families, but they could sell the excess to the planters' table, to George Washington, or nearby in the markets in the city of Alexandria. The poultry that was raised as well by enslaved folks across all 5 farms, we do know was sold in Alexandria markets to purchase all manner of goods, from things such as the buttons, items of adornment, to what have you. So I just want to point out some of these faunal remains. This whole case on the bottom here, these are all, for the most part, fish. You do see number 50, that's actually blue crab claws. Things that could have been actually caught here or purchased in those markets in Alexandria. And the fish were probably all coming from the Potomac locally. The case above, these are land animals. And number 41 is interesting in particular because it's a turtle shell. So you're actually looking at items that can be picked up in the woods opportunistically as you're going about your business or going through to visit family members on one of the other 5 farms. Remember that you're working during the day, 6 days a week. So your time to hunt is either going to be Sunday or at nighttime. The animals that are out at night tend to be nocturnal animals, things like possum and raccoon, that become a big subsistence boon for the enslaved folks as well, for the enslaved community. So you're really looking at folks that are doing all they can to provision themselves and their families. And when we think about the archaeology here, for example, our cemetery project, and you can learn a lot about that online as well. It's a long-term research project to rediscover graves in the cemetery, which are adjacent to the Washington tomb, primarily for folks that were enslaved here and their descendants. We think it's a multi-generational cemetery. When we think about who's buried there, we have to again have that picture in our minds about the neighborhood. How are the family structures and community and kinship structures organized? Because if you have a spouse that lives on one of those other 4 farms and one of you dies, where are you buried? If your relatives are already in the cemetery here at Mansion Farm and you live on an outlying farm and you have additional deaths in the family, where are they buried? So we think that the cemetery here really represents, for example, the final resting place of those individuals reflects the community that they created. The families that cut across all 5 farms and throughout this region. Really, it's with their help and their hands that George Washington was able to become the visionary leader and founder of the nation that we all know and respect. So I think I'm not sure how much time I've taken, probably more than was expected, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So if you guys have questions about this or archaeology in general, and I also want to put in a plug for our next live stream, our archaeology live stream is coming up this Friday, where Sean Devlin, our curator of archaeological collections, will actually be taking a lot of the objects out of our lab and laying them out and talking about what we know about the enslaved folks based upon our archaeological excavations as well.
All right, thank you, Jason. We've got a lot of questions. The first one is from Cynthia. She says, given that Mount Vernon was a neighborhood, how much freedom did a slave have to walk around the plantation? And was there a certain radius for a slave depending upon where he or she worked/lived?
That's a wonderful question. So by Virginia law, after 1785, you had to have a pass, basically the permission of your owner to travel off plantation. That was something that was, depending on the neighborhood and how well you were known, may or may not be enforced, but it is a law in the books. And basically you had to have permission to move, to travel, to go off the place you were designated to work and live. Here at Mount Vernon, because the 5 farms are almost connected, or they really are connected by the forest in between them, we think that there probably was a little bit more freedom to travel and visit families, especially since Washington prioritized marriage and family life. He said that for his own life, he said that marriage would either be the foundation of happiness or misery. So take that how you want. But we do know that he recognized and even promoted enslaved marriage. So he also complained about what he termed night walking, which is basically folks visiting their spouses, family members, community members away from their quarters of residence and the hours when you're not working. So that would be nighttime, right? So he complained that people would be worn out when they had to go back out to their work tasks from being up at night. And for the most part, you can get to any of the farms at Mount Vernon from one of the others by walking basically no more than 3 miles or thereabouts. For Sam Anderson, we know that he had a boat, and that's because River Farm, where his family lived, was the other side of a creek that's attached to the home farm here. So we think he probably actually used alternate transportation to get there. Now, if you're married to someone abroad, which is the historic term for off plantation, you actually had to get the approval of both masters. So each spouse had to say, my enslaved person can marry the other enslaved person. And generally, they're, for the most part, probably going to be neighbors. But the enslaved cohort at Mount Vernon was a little more widely traveled than a lot of other plantations because people traveled with the Washington household. People like Billy Lee went to war through the entire Revolution with George Washington, right, as his personal valet. The Washington household in Philadelphia throughout 2 presidencies, while the federal city of DC was being constructed, is a place that had deep connections with Mount Vernon. That's actually where Hercules and Oni Judge both departed the Washington household to liberate themselves, right? So that's kind of a long-winded answer to say it really just depends. It's one of those things that's on the books, but it was widely understood in the Chesapeake region for the most part that people were going to visit their enslaved family members that lived on nearby plantations. And we have examples of people walking or borrowing animals like horses to walk upwards of 10 miles each way to visit family members. Here at Mount Vernon, because it's a little more consolidated, the 8,000 acres is all contiguous, you probably actually have a very good deal of people traveling at night and on Sundays to visit those family members. And Washington complained about that, like I said, a bit. But at the same time, as long as these folks were productive, Washington let it slide. So again, it really just depends. It depends on the neighborhood, the region, and the administrators, officials, and masters, how they felt about their enslaved folks visiting. I can think of a couple of historic examples from the 18th and 19th century of people visiting and staying away too long, and that's usually when discipline and violence kicks in. That could be a week, that could be a month, it really just depends. So around here, we expect that there was a very significant degree of traveling. That's a great question.
Thank you, Jason. And Miriam asked, how many people bunked in each room? Also, what were the beds made out of?
That's another great question. Well, in the house for families, I mean, really all we have is the image and the painting here, and the cellar, since the rest of it is kind of not standing, it's been destroyed by modern infrastructure here. There could have been as many as 67 people living in that in the 1780s. It's a very big structure. We think they were probably organized into family groups inside the structure, but we don't actually have plans of it, so it's hard to say. In these bunkhouses, well, you could actually see the number of beds. We do know a little bit more about kind of and this is from archaeology here at Mount Vernon and from surviving documents in archaeology throughout the Chesapeake Bay region, that as we shift into cereal grain agriculture, we tend to have smaller houses that are usually 1 room, maybe 2, with a division where you have a family or extended family in each room. And you might have upwards of 8 to 12 people in a room. So we actually have a reconstructed quarter here that you can visit that's based upon archaeology, historic documents, and a surviving photograph of what was, we think, a surviving quarter on one of the outlying farms. And we put all that together and built a reconstruction here. And it's 1 room with a loft It's a log house, and we probably would have had traditionally around 12 people living in a house such as that, which is a family or extended family, give or take. So it's pretty crowded spaces. The beds themselves were often made, and the primary plantation provision here that is not fish is corn. And that's true across the entire region, right? The main Native American staple becomes part of the Southern food diet here. If you grew up in rural Virginia as I did, I still grew up eating cornbread every day, right? That became part of our foodways, right? So that's true because of the plantation period here. So you're grinding that up, and remember, Washington did operate a grist mill. So you're grinding up that corn into meal or grits, and you also have the corn cobs. So the corn cobs are dried, and they become the stuffing material for the majority of pallets or beds that are used in all of these different types of dwellings. Of course, you can stuff basically the mattress with anything you want, but we do have this big supply of corn cobs, and that tends to be from historic surviving examples. We know that was probably one of the main items that was used to form the cushioning material, if you will.
All right, and Adam asks, so was it common for enslaved folks at Mount Vernon to be allowed access to firearms for hunting? That wasn't too common in the South, was it?
So that's the one that we usually get questions about, and it's a wonderful question, right? The 18th century is quite a bit different than the 19th century in terms of kind of the characteristic of enslaved life. After the 1830s in Virginia, we have the Nat Turner uprising, and a lot of laws really, I guess, the hammer comes down after that, and that's when it is absolutely forbidden. Literacy is withheld from enslaved populations for fear of people writing passes to free themselves, or for fear of someone like Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, creating another uprising. But before that, and we have historic examples here, and obviously we have the archaeological examples of people, enslaved folks, with access to firearms and dogs. I didn't really mention dogs, using hunting dogs in a lot of cases as well. Dogs were also outlawed later in the 18th and early 19th century in Virginia, dogs that were held by enslaved folks for the same reason. So at other plantations from the period, like Carter's Grove or Kings Mill or Westover, all along the James River and along the Williamsburg area, and here at Mount Vernon, we've discovered gun flints. Birding shot is what we're looking at here, so probably ducks, geese, waterfowl, and of course little critters like the rabbit that you saw in the other room. And we do know that we're also finding the food remains, right? So we have kind of both ends of that food procurement and the food that's eaten. In the first decade of the 19th century, the city of Alexandria, and I don't know if this expanded into Fairfax County or the state of Virginia, outlawed firearms ownership by enslaved folks outright. Sam Anderson was freed by Washington's will, effectively freed in 1801. He was a well-known hunter. In 1806, he actually petitioned the city council of Alexandria for a license, basically, to own his firearm to continue his hunting practice. And he was so well-known, and remember, this is also a couple of years after Washington's passing, and basically his enslaved folks became celebrities in their own rights, people that had known George Washington, right? So Sam Anderson was actually given permission to hold firearms after it was outlawed in the rest of the region. And through his sales of animals that he hunted, he actually purchased several of his children and grandchildren out of enslavement. So that was his livelihood, basically, after he was emancipated, right? So it's not incredibly common in the 19th century. It seems to be pretty common in the last decades of the 18th century across these plantation regions. And we do think that a lot of waterfowl in particular landed on the mansion house tables. And that's not just for Mount Vernon, that's for the other plantations in the region as well. It's a wonderful question.
All right, and Alice asked, did you make your bricks on site? Did the enslaved make their bricks on site building some of these buildings?
No, that's another wonderful question, right? So if you look at the brick stable, for example, which you can actually see it here. It's original, it's still standing. The earlier stable was timber framed and it burned down.
So building a brick stable was a way of kind of fireproofing for the 18th century. It took, at least it was estimated in the documents, 77,000 bricks to make the original part of that stable. Where did those bricks come from? We do know archaeologically, and this is actually something that we hope to pursue as a research topic a little in the near future, is that we have discovered several brick clamps or remains of brick clamps, which is basically a kiln you make after taking the clay and kind of creating the soft mold of bricks. You actually have to fire them, right? So you kind of build a kiln from those bricks, light the fire inside it, you wait for it to eventually cool down, you dismantle the kiln, there's your bricks. So in the 18th century, particularly in the 17th and then especially in the early 18th century, a lot of these throughout the region, the big manor homes start rising in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, 60s. A lot of the bricks to create all of those structures are made on the plantations. We're not actually sure here. My intuition is that a lot of bricks were made here or on neighboring plantations that were used to build things here. But that's a research topic we actually need to know more about. And that's a wonderful question because it's a question we have ourselves. Now, remember here at the Mansion House Farm, this is where primarily if you're enslaved, you're probably a skilled laborer. And that includes masonry, joinery, carpentry, down to the cobbler, right? The folks that are making the clothes and the shoes that are being plantation provisions. Your goal is to be a self-sufficient enterprise if you're a plantation. And that includes making as much as you can yourself, which is why Washington maintained a blacksmith shop. The blacksmith shop here, we know, repaired broken plows and other bits of machinery for neighboring plantations. So my intuition is, knowing what we know of George Washington and the fact that he wanted to be as self-sufficient as possible, I think that it's probably a fair guess to say that a lot of the bricks that were used here were probably made on the 5 farms.
And I may have butchered Alice's question a little. I think she may have meant, sorry, Alice, was the bricks that we have reconstructed this structure out of made on site?
Oh, I gotcha. Okay. It depends on the period in which the buildings were reconstructed or rehabilitated here. We do try to reuse historic bricks if they are structurally safe. And I'm sure our architectural staff can tell you anything you want to know about the bricks. As an archaeologist, we usually look at the broken parts, right? But we do know it was good historic practice to reuse bricks, and we have tried to reuse them wherever possible if it is safe to do so.
Okay, thank you. 2 good answers to 2 good questions. We have a question from Periscope. What is the difference between restored versus reconstructed buildings? Good question, too.
That's another wonderful question, and I'm going to try not to butcher it. Again, I usually look at the things that aren't standing anymore, and our architectural staff can tell you, again, anything you want to know about the maintenance and construction of those buildings. So I definitely encourage that if I don't give a good answer, follow up and send us an email, and we'll get it to the experts that can give you the answer. In my mind, a reconstruction is like the blacksmith shop, where actually we did archaeology. It was not standing anymore. One of the descendants that inherited the estate after George and Martha Washington passed away, and went to George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, who was a Supreme Court justice. He actually built several things here at Mount Vernon. He built a new carpenter shop. He built a couple of additions onto the greenhouse complex here. And he built an ice house that actually lay on top of the 18th century blacksmith shop. Now, through a series of archaeological excavations over basically 2 decades in bits and pieces, we actually came up with a plan to reconstruct that from scratch. So we have historic accounts, we have archaeology, we have the surviving records, and that was the knowledge base used to recreate that building. So I understand that as a reconstruction. Something like this that was partially still standing is a little bit along the lines of what can we save and what do we have to rebuild, and that's a little bit more complicated endeavor in a lot of ways. So for a lot of places like Mount Vernon, the majority of our buildings that are standing are original. We do have a few anachronisms, very few. We have the office building I pointed out, and we have the earliest museum building that was built here right in the historic core that's still standing. But the rest of what you see here is either original or has been made or rehabbed along the lines of how it originally would have looked. So you're getting really an accurate and authentic picture of what this place would have looked like in 1799 when George passed away. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes. Thank you, Jason. And Susan asked, what is the most surprising item that has been found on a dig at Mount Vernon?
Wow, I think that depends on who you ask. For me, one of my favorite things is actually a building that we discovered a few years ago that was completely undocumented. For most of the things here, and we are a much better documented plantation than the majority of plantations throughout the region. First of all, the Civil War in the 1860s, the majority of Virginia counties sent all of their historic records to Richmond, the capital, which burned. So the majority of counties are considered burned counties in terms of the historical knowledge. But because this was the home of George Washington, because we have all of the correspondence from the Revolution, from the presidencies before and after, we have this huge documentary base, and a lot of this was curated by family members and descendants, and we've managed to reorganize a lot of it. So we have this huge documentary base. So it's very unusual to find a structure, a building, a physical building that stood in the historic core here and not know anything about it. And that's exactly what happened in the South Grove area, which is right next to the kitchen. If you visit today, we actually found an earlier outbuilding that was probably razed, torn down in the 1770s when George Washington decided to reorganize the space into how you see it today when you visit. So he built new outbuildings, tore down the old ones. And the interesting thing about it was it did not have a brick foundation. It was a timber frame building of an earlier construction style called earth-fast or post and ground building, which happens to be the most common construction type in the Chesapeake region throughout the 17th century and into the 18th. But the majority of the buildings here do have brick foundations or actually sandstone foundations, because we have the Aquia Sandstone Formation, which also is what most of the federal city of DC is constructed of. So if you're used to seeing those stone buildings in DC, the very same source of stone was used here as well. So you have to imagine a building where instead of building a timber frame and resting at the top a foundation of stone or masonry, the vertical framing members, the posts that hold the building together, are plugged right into the ground. And so we actually found those post holes, those structural supports. And that was 2016, 2017, so very recent. So that's obviously very exciting for us, but doubly exciting because it was completely unknown and completely undocumented, and we would still not know about it if it wasn't for the archaeology staff, which is exciting for us.
Yes, then we have time for just a couple more questions. Debbie asked, you mentioned that houses on the other farms wouldn't have likely been brick, but possibly log. Would there have been any other advantage for enslaved people to live on one farm rather than another?
That's a question that's really hard to answer because it's very subjective, and it really depends on the experience of the people that are there in the time, right? I'm going to try to see if you can pan over. Can you see this image? Just occurs to me, this is an image of the cabin that we reconstructed on the grounds here at Mount Vernon. And so you can actually visit this when we reopen. And you can see the type of construction, right? And this is based again upon archaeology and upon this photograph, which actually shows a similar structure that we think was probably part of one of these outlying quarters from the Washington period here at Mount Vernon. So you can see the people for scale. It's basically one room, and you have a loft above. Now notice this does not have glazed windows, meaning there's no glass windows. You basically have a shutter that you open and close. So if you're from this region, you know that it gets muggy. You know there are mosquitoes, there are snakes, there are all kinds of things that can get in and out of these structures, right? And then of course there's the elements themselves. This does have a pretty large fireplace, which is actually, you can see that the chimney itself is actually log and clay as well. And the advantage to this is that if the chimney catches on fire, you can actually pull it away from the house. So that's actually a technological advancement that we see in quarters throughout this region as well. And it also suggests that these things probably catch on fire quite a bit, right? So I really don't know how to answer that. I would say that it really probably depends on the personal situation of the individuals at the time. Is it better to live with your family and extended family in one of these, or spread out across the states in a masonry structure? Again, that's really subjective. In either instance, where you go is dictated to you by your work assignment. And we do know here, again, that the majority of enslaved adults are part of families. Only 1/3 of those families are able to cohabitate in the same structure, and the rest were split out across the 5 farms. So I'm not sure. It really would just depend, again, on the individual situation. That's a tough question to answer. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Jason. And our last question comes from Rachel. How does one become an archaeologist? I'm 3/4 of the way through an history major, anthropology/archaeology minor degree, and want to focus on archaeology.
Well, that's pretty much how I started. You sound like me 25 years ago. Basically, you have to have an interest in the past, obviously. All archaeologists work with the physical material remains that are left behind by past peoples, whether that's objects, things like this, or whether that's bits and pieces of the landscape that you can't take back to the lab, things like the cellar over there, or a well, or a post hole. So we look at the landscape, we look at these objects, and you have to kind of have a little bit of a detective brain to work backwards from that. We're basically looking at people's trash, right? In these instances, or we're looking at modifications to the land that they've left behind. So when I look at the landscape of Mount Vernon, I see the hands of all of these individuals and how they shaped this place that we see and enjoy today, right? That's their legacy, along with their descendants who can tell their own stories, right? Their own family stories. So this is their physical legacy, and of course, obviously they have their family legacies. So you have to have that interest. I also have degrees in anthropology. I have a PhD in anthropology. I was fortunate myself to fall in with one of the people that created the field of historical archaeology, James Dietz, who was one of the people that, taught me how to do this, but really taught us all how to do this. Of course, other people might be interested in ancient Egypt or other places, right? So I'd say if you want to be an archaeologist, first of all, know that it's a very tough, long, winding road. Follow your interests. Do not give up, because it is a tough profession to remain in. But it's a very rewarding profession. And it's one that I've spent 25 years in and wouldn't trade it for anything. So continue with those classes in whatever way, shape, or form they take this fall, whether you can do it in person or online. We also usually accept volunteers to work with us. We're kind of trying to figure out how that's going to work with the pandemic, and that might be disrupted for the remainder of this year. But certainly when we get past the global pandemic, we'd be happy to take volunteers again in the field and in the lab. And we really enjoy working with folks that have that interest as well. So stick with it is the main thing I can say. It sounds like you're already on your way, and just follow those interests. And take every experience you can to get practical archaeological experience in the field, in the lab, working with documents, whatever you can do.